Thank you, everybody. Welcome. All right, yeah, so great to see everyone here interested in this topic. We are a web development company. We are rooted in this. We do this daily, but this is not going to be a technical talk, just to allay any fears. There's some technical things I'll get into, but it's largely about building empathy and understanding the needs of people unlike yourselves, basically. So like I said, we're a full service web agency, headquartered here, although we're distributed. We have a number of employees across the country right now. Our job is to help companies with digital strategy, user experience design, and open source content management systems mostly, but we also do a lot of other things too. Our clients have included companies like Blue Cross Blue Shield, the RISD Museum, Lycogea Systems, NBC Sports, among others. We have a pretty good mix, I would say, of local clients as well as national. We're passionate about Drupal, one of the systems that we work with largely. We have a number of our developers are really ingrained in that community, and it just is another way to illustrate the fact that we love doing things like this. We love sharing the knowledge that we gather, and making sure that other people can have some of that expertise as well. We're keeping a close eye also on emerging tech like distributed CMSs and headless CMSs, React and Gatsby. If you want to geek out at any point, flag one of us down and we'll be right there with you. So as a way of introduction, I'm Jay Hogue. I am Director of Design and UX here. That means I have a scientific, research, technical, as well as visual side to me. I love typography, I love accessibility, I love the power of CSS and HTML, what they can help us do. I kept my colleague Kathy up here as well, because we've done a webinar on this previously, we've done trainings on accessibility previously, and she's another in-house expert. Just wanted to make it known that it's not just me. There's a lot of other people in the company who are starting to become more aware of how to handle these sorts of issues. So we'll have time for Q&A as well at the end. If you have questions that come up, jot them down, bring them up at the end. We'll try to address them, as many of those as we can. So first, there's a lot of here. I'm not going to do a question and answer session now exactly, but I'm going to try to read people's minds. Why are they here? What is interesting to you about this sort of topic? So, generally, I think accessibility is something that we should all care about, but it does take work to understand why it's important. It takes work to empathize with anyone that might benefit and who might experience the world in a different way. So some of you in the audience might be starting to become aware of this idea of accessibility on the web, and you're just here to understand a little bit more, just really general background. Some of you, probably a good portion, might know people who already benefit greatly from things that are inclusive at their core. You have a family member or you have an older parent or something, so you understand why it's important, you understand what kind of issues they might come up against in their day-to-day life. So you'd like to know maybe a little bit more about the how. And then, sadly, I think still some of you here have been thrown into this kind of abruptly. Maybe people are starting to get sued. There's a lot of litigation out there around this topic. And that's an okay reason to be here. It's reality, but it's certainly, hopefully, we can help kind of allay some of those fears, but also add a layer of understanding to that so you understand why it's happening, what the history of that is, and what it means potentially for your own company. But finally, I like this most because you probably didn't come here that you would understand that an investment in accessibility can actually translate to bottom line rewards. And it's true because really what we're thinking about here is expanding the reach that you can have with your content, that you can have with your product or your tool. The more people that use it, the more potential revenue you might see, depending on what it is, what kind of service you're actually offering. And that's really at the core here. We're trying to make sure that as many people can use your service as possible. That's what I think it's all about. So With that, no matter the reason, welcome. We're glad you're here. I'm going to start with a little bit of a history lesson first. So accessibility on the web actually goes all the way back to 1990 with accessibility to public buildings. So in 1990, it was codified into law with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act under the first George Bush. It was an extension of the Civil Rights Act, actually, that went all the way back to 1964. And it granted people with disabilities the same rights as anyone else, and it passed both houses at the time with wide support, which you can't imagine now. But enforcement of the ADA and Section 508 is actually handled by the Department of Justice. And so the language of the law provides full and equal enjoyment of places and public accommodation. That's what the law says. But defendants since then have been arguing that the web is not a place of public accommodation. So state circuit courts have been scrambling to interpret the law, and some have been interpreting it in different ways. And we've seen that start to play out. 2006 was the first major court case to cite the ADA, where a major retailer, Target, was sued because their website was not accessible to the blind. So in September 2018, 12 years later, 12 years after 2006, the DOJ finally clarified in a letter to Congress that indeed they interpreted websites as public accommodation. And that makes sense. The web has become ingrained in our day-to-day. If you think about banking, if you think about going to the doctor even, everything is online. And so making that and declaring it in law a public accommodation makes a lot of sense. But even with that clarification, it's difficult to understand the idea of equal enjoyment. What does that actually mean? So in a recent case of Domino's versus Robles, Domino's tried to make the case that their website did not have to be accessible to the blind because they also offer a phone ordering system. More of a separate but equal concept. The idea to them was that blind users should just resign themselves to calling rather than the convenience of ordering online. Who here hates to call? Yeah. So their argument was that it was like claiming stairs were not accessible because there's a ramp right next to it that someone in a wheelchair can use. That was the basis of their legal argument. The plaintiff in that case turned that around a little bit with a more compelling perspective. To them, it seemed like a non-disabled customer has access to the front door that adjoins the sidewalk that's right off the parking lot, while disabled customers must enter the back door via a ramp near the dumpsters. It's not equal enjoyment. It's separate, but certainly not equal. So to them, poor website experiences were the virtual equivalent of a back alley entrance. So equal enjoyment has come to mean access to the same content and the same services that everyone else can have, regardless of their ability. So if a deaf person should be able to use the phone, right? That's existed for a long time. Web options for the blind makes sense. It's not a visual medium only. So separate, in other words, can never truly be equal. And that seems to be the arguments that are coming out a lot of the recent large court battles that are coming up around this. So again, in the world of architecture where the ADA was born, as designers and developers, I think we can find a lot of inspiration in that, because architects have already become very good at working within these guidelines. Just think about any public building. It's not stopped them from producing stunningly beautiful spaces like the Disney Concert Hall here by Frank Gehry in LA. The importance of the ADA is easy to understand in the physical world, in real life, because we can see that different people have different ways of moving through the world, right? I mean, walkers, strollers, wheelchairs, canes. That's easy to see. It's much harder to see it on the web. Unlike public spaces, it's easier to ignore, frankly. There's no real trash-strewn back alleys, but there might be virtual ones. You can't easily see how people use your website unless you've struggled with it yourself. So this lack of immediate insight is why much of the web is inaccessible to a majority of users. And so what this is showing, in 2016, there was a study in the UK that found that 70% of the websites under the study had usability issues. The study then tried to extrapolate that and figure out what the spending power of that group was. What was being denied? These were the folks who would, quote, click away. So they calculated that UK businesses were leaving about $11 billion on the table by having inaccessible websites and web services. A similar study was done in the US, and the picture was not very good either. So WebAIM tested 1 million homepages with automated tools, and the results were pretty bad. Only 2.8% of homepages passed the test. And since automated tools don't surface errors that a human user might encounter, the actual number of homepages might be even worse, closer probably to 1%, or about 10,000 sites out of 1 million. It's not all bleak, though, I do want to say. Of the problems that were detected, a large portion of them are relatively easy to fix, which means that they've happened out of carelessness, not out of malice. And so things like this are ways in which we're trying to educate folks into understanding what that looks like and what that means. We'll talk about some of those common issues later on as well. So this is the big picture. This is the broad picture and some of the history of the challenges on the web. But now I'd like to start to get people to empathize with what's actually going on. The thing that we forget, I think, when talking about disabilities is that any one of us can be temporarily disabled. It's pretty easy, actually. We need to think more broadly about accessibility because it's not just for that small subset of the population that might be blind or deaf or something else. So the numbers around the permanently disabled population don't tell the whole story, but we do have numbers. According to the most recent census, the numbers are, I think, still pretty substantial. 57 million Americans reported having disability in 2012, which is about 1 in 5. It breaks down into different groups. Some have difficulty lifting or grasping, some have cognitive conditions, some have severe vision impairments, some have severe hearing. So that's a large group of anyone that might say that they have some sort of disability. A little more than half of those folks go online regularly. And in this age where banking, healthcare, and work-related tasks are all online, remember this was 2012, that should be just no surprise. If anything, that's gotten a lot higher. So we can assume more and more people are going online all the time. So while 1 in 5 Americans is notable, we should get beyond that statistic alone because it's not the whole story. The Microsoft inclusion team, I think, has it right when they say that ability is actually a spectrum. What we call normal abilities can be impermanent. So they can be temporary like an injury, but also temporary based on the situation that someone is in. A new parent is likely to conduct their daily tasks with only one hand, holding their newborn all day. A driver needs turn-by-turn directions read out loud so they can keep their eyes on the road. That's accessibility. A bartender will have trouble hearing while at work. And voice inputs like Siri and Alexa should account for heavy accents. Why would we have called any of these people disabled just because they're in a situation that temporarily limits their senses and abilities? Probably not. So our products need to support those who are blind, sure, but also those whose eyesight is just simply not as good as it used to be. Or if your product relies on sound, can someone with a sinus infection still use it? Does your voice-controlled product also provide manual control for those that might have laryngitis? The folks that we normally think of when we hear disability they're just part of the landscape. So let's look at some numbers again with that in mind. At any given point, the number of people who would benefit from an inclusive website, I think, is far greater than you might expect. So one example, the number of Americans who have only one arm is low at about 26,000 out of roughly 327 million, right? But add to that 13 million people who break an arm every year, all right? And then maybe 8 million new parents holding newborns all the time. And you have 21 million people now, or about 12%, who might need to use your website with only one hand on a phone or a tablet or whatnot. Not to mention people that might be driving and using their phone or holding onto a subway railing or, any of these other things, any of these other temporary factors that limit your ability to interface with something. The more and more you think about it, the larger and larger that number becomes. So there's the numbers, but then there's also possible returns on investment when you do think about multiple ways to consume the same bits of content, which is what is at the core here. There might be unexpected ways in which you're supporting other methods for folks. So an anecdote that I love is actually from an article I came across called Generation Z Loves Closed Captioning. And the takeaway was that, you know, the words at the bottom of a screen that we intended for the deaf or hard of hearing are being used by young folks who want to multitask. It's another input mode. It's another way to focus on the content at hand. Aside from that, I mean, we've seen this too in our Facebook feed probably. You don't have sound turned on because you're in a loud environment or you're in a quiet environment. You can still consume that content and you can still read what's happening on the screen. There's all these other ways that these methods can help folks in temporary situations. It's not just, you know, think of it as it's not just a business goal of, oh, I need to add closed captioning to all my videos. That's going to be so expensive. And I know I only have a handful of deaf users. Well, that's not the use case. There's so many other use cases than just that one little narrow disability that you're trying to solve for. So to wrap up this section, your definition of disability, I hope, has expanded a little bit. It's not a personal health condition. It's the way in which a person deals with the world and the things that are in it. It's a mismatch between how I can interact with a thing and how that thing has been designed to be interacted with. Well, the solution to the problem of how can we make the web more inclusive is that we just need better design, and we need to intend to be inclusive from the start. We can get better too, I think, when we understand what good accessibility looks like and how to use some of these tools. So I'm going to look at a couple of real-world examples, and hopefully we'll acquire some accessibility superpowers. So the first accessibility superpower is well-formed semantic HTML. So that's the technical part of this discussion. That's as far as we're going to go. And the second is keyboard navigation, actually. So here I created a simple form to demonstrate the power of what comes out of the box with HTML. Nothing fancy to look at, but it's an example of things that are done right. So we've used many of the default semantic form elements to make it more usable and understandable, not just to a sighted user, but also to a user who has a screen reader, whose only means of understanding the content is having it read out loud, which is a very linear experience. We can jump around, we can skim. It's very different when you have to read it basically top to bottom. The larger groups and boxes and things are called field sets. These are containers for other form elements. Why would you need that? Think about a checkout form where you have a billing address and a shipping address. They're all going to have the same address fields, state, zip, etc. But that field set around it lets you know which address and which state and which zip code pertaining to what. Those are really important semantically. And then they're also useful for grouping checkboxes and radio boxes and things of that nature. So that's the field set that I'm referring to. To see this in a different light, this is what a screen reader will actually read out loud when it encounters a single input. And there's a lot here that it has to kind of try to communicate that we might take for granted. So it has to read out first, it has to read the field label. So that first name, what's expected, and then whether or not that field is required, and then what you do with that field. It's an edit text field. And then if there's a placeholder, in this case, the word Jane is an example of a first name, that actually gets read out in a slightly different voice. So it sounds different and it feels different than everything else. So it's understood as temporary input text. It's not permanent. And then the name of the group that this belongs to. Again, so you can understand, oh, this address is part of a bigger group, or this name is part of a bigger group. Here's another one. Here's what a radio button looks like. Again, it's part of a group. It's required. It's one of two options. And the group that it's part of is address type. Down here, a drop down, a select list is pretty similar. It's called a pop-up button. and you access that in a different way. Now, if I'm keyboard tabbing, which we'll do next, you can access that in a different way. Screen readers do it differently as well. So the takeaway here is really that there's ways to add context to users for assistive devices. There's ways to think about that, but a lot of it is baked right into the way HTML already works. If we're using the right elements, we get a lot of power right out of the box. I think one of the traps that people fall into with emerging tech is doing it in a brand new way. Like, I'm gonna create my own type of form. I'm gonna create my own input field. I'm gonna use a div instead, which has no semantic weight whatsoever. You have to do extra work to make it do what HTML already does out of the box. So it's one of the things that we try to avoid whenever possible. This is an animated GIF of what keyboard tabbing looks like. Does anyone use their keyboard to navigate a form? Anyone ever tried that? Only about half. This is I call it a superpower, because once you get into the first field, you can just tab through. You can tab and type, tab and type. It's a really quick way to get through, but that's accessibility. That means that now you don't have to rely on your mouse or trackpad. You're just using your keyboard. There's some people that use only their keyboard all day. That's how they navigate everything. They don't have fine motor control, so a mouse is too fine. They'll use something like a keyboard instead. And then when it's done right, you can do everything that you can do with a mouse. You can input text, of course, but you can select things. I can type the letter R, I'll get Rhode Island. I can type V, jump back up to Vermont. I'm tabbing. A space bar will select something. Arrow keys will go through groups of checkboxes or radio buttons. You can do everything else with just a keyboard. And I encourage you to go, if you have a website that's part of your company, try the form, see if it works. Are you tabbing to, like, this little blue outline is a visible way to tell where that cursor is? If I'm not pointing to it with my mouse, I need another visual indication for that, right? So that's what the blue outline is designed to do. So many designers try to kill that, but it's a really important feature that should be supported. What was my point? The other way to think about this is that, again, there's multiple ways to consume and use your tool, use your content. And this is something anyone can do right away, and get a good sense of whether you're doing the right thing. That same form can still be made pretty. You know, I did the bare bones version just to show you what comes right out of the box, but you can still do a lot of enhancement to make it a better user experience and make it part of your brand. Here, we're just styling things a little bit differently. We're adding another means of success or failure to denote to folks whether they're doing the right thing. And it's important too that it's not only color. One of the things about, I'll talk a little bit more about later, is it's not just color that denotes success or failure. It's maybe a shape or a pattern. There's different ways. If you have a colorblind, if you are colorblind and red and green look the same, how else can I tell the difference between those two things? How else can I be sure that I'm going about this in the right way? So shape and color should be used together. But this is just to say that we don't have to sacrifice design. We don't have to sacrifice visuals to also do the right thing and support folks that may not be visual. And I love this quote because it's true. I don't think anything, like I said at the top, is being done out of malice. I think it's just because we think about ourselves, we think about the way we interpret the world. Maybe if we have a loved one who has some sort of issue, we understand the way they interpret the world. But until you start to think about a lot of other ways that people need to navigate this space, navigate this world, you don't really understand why it's important to do these things. And if you don't, then it's not stupidity, it's lack of information, it's lack of understanding. And so I hope this is starting to help that for you. All right, we've used some history, some business reasons. You've heard a little bit about why we should care. I want to briefly discuss also like why accessibility does require some extra effort and some investment. So we're a Drupal shop, we're an open source shop. There's a lot of great accessibility that comes out of the box with some of these tools that are out there. And they benefit from a large and diverse community that helps contribute back and make sure all of those edge cases are being met. Both of these projects and many others have also internal accessibility initiatives. They're constantly checking in and making sure anything new that they're adding supports their internal accessibility goals. The problem comes from when customization needs to start to happen on these platforms, and it always does. As soon as you start to customize, as soon as you think about custom themes or extra modules or third-party widgets, extra effort needs to be put in to make sure that those are also adhering to the same guidelines, the same goals as the rest of the business or the rest of the software that you're using. Common accessibility problems arise from different places, but that's a good indication of what we're trying to talk about here. So like if you have a third-party Instagram widget, for example, that might be the core of your accessibility issue. And if it's on your website, you are still responsible for that code. That's part of your experience now. So you have to be careful sometimes about using third-party systems to do a certain thing. If they don't meet your accessibility goals, you might be held liable for that. It does tread into some legal territory as well. And finally, some accessibility problems always come from forms, from anything interactive, anything that you're requiring user input from. Those are red flags. Those are things that you want to make sure you test and are doing the best you can with those to make them as widely available as possible. Some more like details here. Content is also a big one. You know, you think about these monolithic CMSs, you're writing content, you're writing blog posts, you're writing maybe email newsletters. Is it well formed? And what that means is, does the hierarchy of it make sense? Not the visual, not the way it looks, but if I were to just look at your content, do the order of headings make sense? Is there a structure to that? We see in the first one, we're jumping around from an H. We got more than one H1, which is also an SEO no-no. But then we're jumping from an H1 to an H3 to an H5. There's like no structure there. There's no cascade. Down at the bottom is what we really should be looking for. We want a single H1. That's the most important piece of content on the page. That's the thing that robots are going to rank highest. But it's also the outline that everything else hangs off of. Everything else supports that. We're talking about that. So it's important to think about your content as well. This is what you have the most control of right now, probably, is your content. Images are another one. Images are really hard, guys. This is the hardest stuff because that old axiom, image is worth 1,000 words. Well, how are you going to describe that image? You don't actually want to use 1,000 words to do it. So when you have image content on your site, if you're familiar with this idea of alt text, that's existed, I don't know how long, a long time. That's been part of HTML from day one. Mostly because way back then, when an image was loading, it would take 20 minutes. I don't know, it would take a long time. What would people see on that image before it loaded? A description of that image, hopefully, something meaningful, hopefully, a reason to wait to see that image. Now it's more for accessibility. It's more to let someone know the context of an image that you might be using, what it is lending to the story. But the harder part is not all images are lending to that story. Not all images are important. Some images should not be described. So you have to make a real conscious choice of when do I describe something, when do I not? So questions around how your organization wants to do this, I mean, really, I think should be part of everyone's editorial guidelines. Should be part of the way you look at content and think about that. If it's just a fluff image, if it's just a pretty header, maybe it doesn't need a description. Maybe it shouldn't certainly be a repeat of the headline because that's already part of your content. That's going to probably ding you with SEO, and for someone who's having that page read out, they're going to hear that twice and wonder why. But then there's other things to also consider. how do I describe that? Am I describing, is it important that this is an image of a child? Is it important that it's summertime? Is the tone of it important? I took a poetic approach to explaining that image, a way to say, maybe in my story, this kind of poetic approach supports what I'm trying to get at, but adds value. It's not valueless. But when it is valueless, when it's not, and this is more of a programming thing, we still want that alt tag to be there, but to be empty. Because what happens is when a screen reader hits an image with no alt text, it's going to read the source. It's going to read the value of that tag. So you're going to get /link/to/image.jpg or JPG actually. Most is what's going to, and that's a jarring experience. That's not content. That's not important. That's not what should be read out. If I really want that image to be invisible to a screen reader, that alt text should be present, but empty. That's the best practice. These are small little things that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, but they affect the out loud, what we call the out loud experience greatly. And they should be part of anyone's editorial thinking. Some other things, I mentioned contrast. I think this one is really easy to grasp because it's also a visual thing. Insufficient colored contrast is part of the guidelines. And you'd be surprised, actually, we've encountered it quite a bit, how many corporate brand guidelines have colors that are not accessible. In other words, if I take that corporate blue and I use it for text, it's not going to pass. I have to make an adjustment with that for it to have the right amount of color contrast so someone with low vision or someone who's colorblind can read that. And so these are examples of what that looks like. And this was one of the easiest ones to fix, honestly. But I think because it's someone's brand, it's a touchy subject a lot of times. We have to be careful about how we communicate this to our clients, how we can educate them along the way and get them to say, you know, if it's used in your logo, it can be your beautiful red color, but if it's used in text, we need to darken that down. And we need to make that a higher contrast. Finally, still in the realm of content, this is more of a pet peeve maybe going into this line, but I think you can follow along here. I really hate to see click here, or I'm starting to also really don't like learn more because it's meaningless and because of another reason as well. These 4 letters they're a tiny touch target. So even for phones, this can be problematic. But more so, this is a piece of your page that's more important than everything else. This is a bit of text that is content, that is an action that you want someone to take. This could be so much more descriptive and useful to someone. Not only to a non-sighted user who, if I were to look at this page and just listen to the links on that page, which is something that they can do, they can bring up in Apple, it's called a rotor, and it'll go through the page outline. It'll read out all the headers. It'll read out all the links, or it'll jump right to form elements. It's a way to quickly scan a page. So if I'm looking at just the links on that page and I see, and I hear, here, learn more, here, I've got no context. I don't know what those links do. So now I have to go back and find them in content and understand what that context is and understand what that link is going to do. It's a poor experience for them, but it's also really a poor experience for SEO as well. These links could be so much better. And this is just a quick example, but these are ways in which I think we need to rethink content and writing for content. We're writing in some ways for robots, but we're also writing for humans. And there's a lot of parallels there to help make that a better experience for both. And this is just another pet peeve that veers on accessibility, but mostly veers on my anal retentive nature. All right, good, you're still out there. All right, so we mentioned guidelines a few slides back. I'll touch on them briefly. They're not exciting reading material, but the words you'll hear coming up again and again are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, I think is how we're saying it. It has 3 levels that site owners can choose from to create their own standard of conformance, and that's important. Level A, level AA, level AAA. The DOJ, the Department of Justice, suggests AA as their standard, as like a goal to try to hit. But not every website has to hit AA for everything. You may not have any video content or any audio content. So all those rules can be set aside. You may have audio content, but you don't need captioning, which is AAA. There's all sorts of ways you can fit those guidelines to the content you already have and to the goals you have as a company, as a business. They're great in that way. And actually, I find them much easier to read now that I've done it a couple times. It's not as scary as it used to be. Their website is a really good tool, a really good resource to figure out, which ones apply and which ones do I want to make an extra effort to try to adhere to that criteria. It's a filterable list. It's pretty user-friendly. So this is something to definitely take a look at and understand if this is going to be something that's important for your business or for your internal team. So understanding the guidelines and how they can be used is the first step, is one of the first steps we should take. But the second is really the plan. Start with a plan. If your organization needs to remediate an existing web property, or create a plan that includes the business goals and the priorities and the editorial guidelines for some of the content things I was talking about. What are the most important, impactful things to fix to your bottom line? What are the things that should be addressed first? If your organization's on the cusp of a redesign or replatform, definitely start planning for accessibility now. You can bet that when a big construction company starts to build, they have a plan in place. They know that the structure will have certain features, and while you can change the final color up to the last minute, you don't want to change the structure halfway through. That's going to cost a lot more money. It's the same here. If you start planning now, if you know those kinds of initiatives are in your roadmap, because this is important stuff and it's going to take some planning, take some time. If you're still in the learning stages for your own organization, there are ways to self-assess. WCAG is the first place I would start, but there's a lot of tools too that you can use to scan your website for common issues. You can use your own website in a new way as well, like with just the keyboard, or if you are a Mac user, turn on VoiceOver, see what that's like. It's pretty difficult at first, I will say. For Windows, I'm not sure what the free version is, but there's an institutional JAWS screen reader tool, and there's a free NVDA tool as well, which are more robotic. I think VoiceOver is slightly nicer, but work with what you have. The testing tools that we recommend that we use in-house quite a bit, there's a WAVE tool, W-A-V-E from WebAIM. That's a Chrome extension that you can add, and it'll do a quick scan of a page. It'll start to kind of teach you what to look for heading structure, for color contrast, for simple malformed HTML issues. That's a great one. Axe 2, A-X-E, is a great one. And if you're SEO folks, you might have used Lighthouse with from Google. That actually is built on top of Axe. Well, so the information you get out of it might be familiar, might be something you've already kind of investigated. Finally too, shameless plug, we are doing more and more accessibility audits ourselves and helping other folks do their own remediation. We can certainly do it ourselves, but if you're not built on something that we would prefer to work with, we can still do a lot to help any organization figure out how to meet the criteria successfully, because it's just a different way of thinking. And it's hard even for us internally to do that consistently all the time, because it's open to a lot of interpretation, and you have to think really hard and outside the box about how someone might use something. How can you be successful when someone is using eye tracking software and a puff stick? They have a completely different way of interacting with the world. And beyond that, as I mentioned too, we're starting to offer more training for internal teams as well. We had one successful in the fall, and I think that's another interesting way to help your organization understand these things more more directly, and I guess more in line with what you see day to day. The great thing about something like that is you can bring your code to us and say, how would we make this better? And we can talk concretely about your exact issues. And all that said, you know, I also think there's a word of caution out there. Because of litigation, there's a lot of services that keep popping up that say that they can make your website accessible for free, or they can give you a certificate of compliance, or you know, they can use AI to make your website better. And most of that's not that great. First off, if it's not accessible by default, without any add-on tool, if I can't go to your website and it's accessible in its natural state, it is not accessible. No tool put on top of that will make it accessible. That's just, I don't know how else to say that. I've seen tools and it makes me cringe because they just are not, they're not in line with the way this all is supposed to work. And there's no recognized certification, unfortunately. I think there would be some good reasons to have something, but the reason why there isn't one is because your content is changing every day. Your site might be able to get a certificate today, but tomorrow you launch a new feature or you launch a new blog post, and that certificate is no good because that content is not accessible. But it's a moving target, which is why something like that does not exist. So don't be too entranced when you see someone saying they can give you a seal or a badge. That stuff doesn't really exist. It doesn't really work. It doesn't mean anything. It might feel good, but it's not going to make someone feel better when they have a really terrible experience with the website. So I'm getting hoarse. It's time to wrap up. Diversity includes being prepared for a diverse audience of devices. We know about mobile devices and laptops and desktops and tablets, but now we have to think about screen readers and joysticks and keyboards and puff sticks and eye trackers and all these other things that we probably haven't ever thought of before. And it's not enough to invite these devices and the people behind them to your party. You have to ask them to dance by giving them a great experience regardless of what they're using. The result, we hope, is a larger and more diverse group of happy customers. They've had a fantastic experience with your product. They feel included, and they're ready to become evangelists for your brand and your products, and that's really all you can ask for. So with that, thanks for listening. You can open up the floor to some questions. If anyone has some, or if you're just burnt out, that's cool too. Thanks. Yeah.
So who has to worry about this? Are there accessibility police out there just go around with the
I wish there were accessibility police. Instead, there are lawyers. And drive-by litigation was a real big thing in the 90s when the ADA first went into effect. And it's a real big thing now, but it's with websites. So you'll have this idea of drive-by, like lawyers looking for a plaintiff who might be left or blind that they can use in a case against. That is happening, unfortunately, more and more. So that's the police. Unfortunately, this law is, that's kind of how it's enforced. That's the way the ADA has always been. It's up to an individual to bring forward a complaint about there's no ramp, or I can't use those stairs, or the door's not wide enough, or your online ordering system doesn't work. So that's what it's come down to. Oh, if I can repeat the question. Oh yeah, so that was about the accessibility police.
Hey Jay, we got a question in here.
No, I was only kidding.
Oh, never mind, she was only kidding.
Are you gonna try to ask me a question too? Anyone else? Anything? Yeah.
My website's not accessible. Can you help? What can you do?
We've had a few of those lately.
question.
I'll say that, yeah. Is how often do people come and they're like under immediate duress and need help? We've been lucky in that we've had half of the folks we've been doing accessibility remediation work for know it's coming. They had a sense that, you know, something down the road is going to happen and I want to be prepared. We've had one or two be like, I'm under investigation for an accessibility problem. Can you help? And we approach both the same way. There's really like, we can't be more expedient necessarily. And sometimes if we're not the team doing the remediation, the best we can do is draw up a document that helps someone else solve those problems and then look to the roadmap. But I will say that with the third-party widget question, we've taken steps to reach out to the makers of some of those things and say, hey, we've seen problems with your product that our client is having that they're responsible for, but can you fix them? And in some cases they said, yes, actually we already fixed it. Your client needs to update their product, which is great. And in other cases, not so much, but sometimes we need to do that because it's a core piece of what they've expected to work and it needs to continue to work. They're relying on someone else at some times. And sometimes it takes an outside company like ourselves to be the ones to say, hey, there's a problem here. Can you address that? You know? So it kind of runs the gamut right now. Yeah. Cool. Anything else, guys? You've been great. Thanks for tagging along with this conversation. I'm available. I will drink up and fix my voice, but if you have other questions you want to ask one-on-one, I'm available. Kathy's available. Any of our team is available. So thanks for listening.